Okay, Kastikian's Web and Starship. Like I said, there's a Kickstarter out on this. Just one of the reasons I felt compelled to discuss at least the original. We don't know what might be fixed or changed. So, if you watch a lot of my videos, you know that quite often I'm not really good at necessarily catching all the rules in a game. And sometimes I screw them up, and sometimes it's a big deal and I have to restart. Sometimes I can just kind of fudge it. Although there were some instances of that in this is one of a much rarer class of games where even if I know the rules, I can't play it in a valid fashion. That's a real problem. And this is the culprit. Attempting to represent a map in 3 dimensions, or a 3-dimensional map and a 2-dimensional board, is a really difficult thing to do. I don't know if I've ever seen a system that worked for me. I should have known that this would be problematic. Well, I did. But I didn't really realize before I bought it. Because it's very much the same map as the role-playing game universe used, and I could never figure out, where I can go to from a given location in that. Well, that's the problem here, is I can't figure out where where can I get to from here, The thing that finally led me to just table this completely was not only do you have to figure out where you can get to, but you also have to figure out, and it's the same kind of process but with a more limited number of spaces, where you can be in supply. And, I screwed up enough in this that I just couldn't keep playing. Reversing things, trying to fix them, etc. One of the things I realized is, so I probably have a little bit of difficulty with geometric situations in general. It takes me a lot of effort to play games like Africa Core, where it's a puzzle about the geometry and how you place your units specifically. Games like that I find frustrating, difficult, I make mistakes in quite often. This takes it to a hugely greater level. Alright, let's talk a little bit about components, which is absolutely, look, this is the component which makes the game unplayable for me. Now, I am going to give a couple of other 3D space games a shot. Star Force Alpha Centauri uses 3-dimensional strategic and tactical movement. And God's Fire, I believe, uses a 3D movement system. Now, I remember having trouble with Alpha Centauri. God's Fires uses little balls within hexes to show the relative altitude. It also, that means another thing. There's less layers to it. This has, wow, somewhere around, I think, around 28 layers high. The map is represented in a manner where the altitude has more distance possibilities of difference than I think you can possibly get through a straight cut. Because the greatest altitude difference is like 13 or 14 in each direction. And the distance across the map, looks like it's about 26. So it's pretty close to a sphere. A difference in the scale of representation or whatever would make that easier, but you couldn't make like Alpha Centauri a habitable system then or whatever. So I don't know. I don't know if there's any solution for that. Now, there is a solution in terms of the player's side. I could even see me playing it enough that I could memorize most of the connections and be really comfortable with making them. And then it's not so much, at least the important ones, and then it's not so much an issue of measuring all the time as having all this data in your head about what the connections are and just kind of seeing them more or less automatically. That would require a lot of plays. That's something I'm not willing to do, especially, so you see me play, you know, SPQR or Alexander, a lot of different plays. Yeah, but they're all different scenarios. And that was the SFB situation too. I played a lot of SFB and really knew it because I could play a lot of the scenarios. And then, better yet, I had ways of generating my own within campaigns and such. This isn't that. This is a standalone singular game. It's competing, okay, let's take another West End game because I don't want to take another space game because I'm having a hard time thinking of one that I would compete with. But it's competing with something like Druid by West End, in which, you know, you've got a single situation. It's an interesting situation. If you're really, really competitive and want to play that game again and again, that's great. But from my point of view, it's something, not that I want to play once and put away, but I probably will not play it more than 2 or 3 times in a year. Back when I had very few games, by very few I mean like under 500, you know. Yeah. Okay, I have a problem. But, and then I probably will not see it again for a couple of years. And then when I take it out, it gets into the rotation of maybe once a year or so. I don't even have that kind of time anymore. I have time to play a game and kind of experience it. And this game would require and I had buddies who were like this and who could drive me into this kind of situation. Let's play this again. I want to understand it. I want to really fully get it. Okay. You know, if you're in that kind of group where you want to play the shit out of it so that you totally understand the game. And that's what I think that's how it was play tested. And I think the play testing was fairly extensive. It at least gives the impression of that. My best point to that is the rules are fairly solid, but also you have this victory level chart where they're just so carefully, you know, the numbers are, it looks like they were balanced ever so carefully, you know. That's the kind of thing that I think requires at least a fairly significant attempt at playtesting the game, trying to break it, etc. Trying to see if there's a killer strategy. Given how asymmetrical it is, that makes sense, because the chance of a killer strategy is very high. So you have to imagine that to try to get this ready for release so that it's acceptable, they would really play it very heavily. But what I don't think they did was sent it out for a lot of blind testing. Or at least if they did, they didn't really take the results or have very honest blind testers. Because who wants to say, I can't fucking get this game, I understand the rules, but I can't think, well, I'm willing to because, you know, I'm a tard. But most people would feel kind of ashamed of that and wouldn't want to come back and say, look, this map is unplayable. Apparently some reviewers did. And Kostikian kind of got on them about that as far as I see him. You know, no, it is unplayable. You can't pick this up without a significant effort unless you're a genius at geometry, at three-dimensional geometry. And this is absolutely important, you can totally picture what's represented by this little tiny number here from whatever distance you are, even if there's all kind of counters all over the map, and just get that whole spatial awareness all at once. The only other way is to play the hell out of this game and get it so that you've memorized most of the major connections. And like I said, that's not an option for me. So this becomes a game that I'm terribly interested in. I would love to be able to play it. That, unfortunately, I think requires a computer representation to be able to play. Because you can you can generate a 3D, an image that gives that 3D representation nicely on the computer. I don't think you can do that with a simple graphic design, and certainly this one has failed to do that. What about other components? This little ruler thing is kind of flimsy. I don't know what I'd suggest. I almost think that it would be best to take a string, take the old mini style, and paint off the markings on there. Then you don't have the numbers or anything. It's a little too long. You know, if it could hold in one piece, it would be kind of cool. But having to be folded, yeah, not so nice. And that's another little hindrance in the whole thing, as is having to move stacks of counters off of the planet so that you can actually make the measure dot to dot. And then, oh yeah, you know, if you forget and move them a little bit off place or something, maybe they end up on the wrong system and you've accidentally colonized something you shouldn't have and lost something you shouldn't have. The counters themselves are the West End standard sort of counters. I've never liked their counters. They have a gloss on them. I don't like their maps either. They have a gloss as well. And gloss on gloss sucks. They have a gloss on them, and they're kind of, they have a softness to them in terms of the texture. They just feel kind of squishy. I don't know how else to put it. And like I said, the rule book, the layout of the rule book in the West End formatting, doesn't work terribly well for me either. It's too complex a game to handle what they do. But very few companies manage it. You have this distances sheet, which is really helpful to getting you kick-started in the game, and it gives you some of those key distances that you can see. Unfortunately, there's a lot of not key ones that can become very important in the game. This isn't a terribly easy tool either to appropriate the game. But what about the play itself? There's something really, really intriguing about this anyhow. And this is why I wish I could play it. The three-player aspect, first of all, was pretty rare at the time. You had things like Hitler's War and stuff, but most real three-player games have come after that. Where you've got a couple of them that came out very recently. Triumph and Tragedy and Churchill come to mind, of course. It's still not a terribly well-filled space in wargaming, and there were plenty of games that could be played in 3, though, especially if you're willing to go to the science fiction route. They tended to be very generic. This has a very specific universe, world, whatever, to it, which is cool. There's more backstory, and even if you don't have all that backstory, obviously the designer had a lot in mind when he created this. It's an asymmetrical game, which is another factor that's really great. The means of movement and supply and everything for the different powers are for the different players are completely different. Well, for 2 of them they are, and the Terrans kind of you get a mishmash of both. You know, figure out how to use them, figure out what you could do if you had both of them, and they have other disadvantages, which is they start off very weak comparatively. But there were some situations in the game that seemed kind of overpowering at one point or another, but then it turns out I was misinterpreting the rules somehow. So I see a real balance between these. It's not a very fluid game. The Perrine, for example, have to wait until a probe hits somebody in order to get there. Or they have to have some ally build them a gateway into their own territory, which sounds pretty dangerous to me. The Gwynfarn have a very limited number of bases, and that's their sphere of influence is based on those bases. And that's what screwed me up at the end was I forgot about that completely. To measure the supply distance. It was hard enough. I made the same mistake very early in the game, and then bang, it hit again. And it's just I know I can't play this through without tremendous pain, and I'm not willing to play enough games to get rid of that pain. And that's really where the problem comes in. If I had a friend who was very geometrically inclined, I might be willing to play the Pyrene if I had a couple of friends who were willing to play the other sides. But those other sides, having to deal with the FTL movement is just too painful. Earth might not be too bad, just because they're so small, and I don't know if they have... I don't see how they can expand, except that they have the web ships. Those are the only thing that I see... that they have them and that they can use them alone. And then the counter, of course, is the Pyrene and the Gwynfarin. Combine, build web ships of their own, and ship Pyrene troops to places the Gwynfarin can sail them. But there's a lot of interaction between these different movement systems that makes the game really, really look intriguing. And I wish I could explore that, but I'm just not willing to put that effort in. So that's what I have to suspect about this. That you've got a very, very interesting puzzle to study if you had 3 people, because playing it solo is obviously not optimal. There's hidden movement for the Pyrene. There's, when you build forces, it's simultaneous, and you kind of would telegraph your move if you do that ahead of time. I can handle it, but again, it's not an optimal situation. But if you had 2 other people who were really interested in exploring this game heavily, guarantee 5 to 10 playings, then yeah, definitely go for that Kickstarter, man. If you don't, though, if you're thinking, well, this would be something fun to play, I'd like to take a look at it, and maybe come back to it every few years or something, forget about it. It's not designed for that kind of thinking. If I was 13 years old and got this, I'd play it heavily because I didn't have anything else to put in its position. But now I've got almost this overwhelming burden of games that demands to be played. And that's the real problem. Those of us, who were around in this era and like games kind of like this, because there's some real problems. So I had real difficulty seeing what was the tens digit and what was the ones digit on the tracks, because they don't differentiate terribly well, and they don't jump out at you. That's really the thing. The information doesn't jump out at you, and maybe the Kickstarter is capable of making things a little easier with some better graphic design. Obviously, West End did not inherit Redmond Simonson, but they also didn't inherit the graphic design geniuses that went on to Victory Games either. And there was true genius there. They did some really good jobs. They did some hideous ones too, but someone was making some very nice and very easy to read maps, counters, etc. that have influenced the industry heavily. Obviously, West End didn't see that as a priority. They grabbed a couple of people, or were formed by a couple of people who had innovative game designs, Goldberg, Kustikin. Berg went over and did some work for them, but I don't think he was really too heavily associated with the company. And if somebody did a really good job on a graphic redesign, I think they could make it easier to cope with, but you're still going to have that 3-dimensional map that I'm not sure how much it can be helped. Springing the data out in it a little bit more, though, would help. Just a little bit more towards making that 3-dimensional. And if there was some graphic... So, here's the thing. what you rely on to determine, you know, how high or low a particular system is this one little circle with a number, and it's color coded. Is it above or below the plane? And that's it, all you have. And two things that are below the plane can be further apart than two things, one above, one below. So you're not getting any really graphical, any immediate visual information that tells you how high is this, how low is this. I think shading might be able to help that. I also think that certain graphic tricks that could make things seem below and above others could have been utilized. This would be really dangerous to play with. You'd need a real expert in the design. None of that is present here. You really don't have an idea how deep the planet is. What is present is a lot of extraneous information, or a lot of extraneous graphical value that doesn't add anything to the play. You have these bleh. And there doesn't seem to be, so you would think, well, maybe the +9 is a bigger circle, but no, here +8 is bigger because of this. They're trying to show the star. Now, how important is that information? Well, Kostikian says, well, I wanted that information on there. It has no value to play, but he wanted that information in there because it's interesting. Okay, great. You could use that same kind of graphic space to show the height relative to each other. It's not done. Instead, something was interesting to me. Okay, great. You know? And the game does not get a good rating, and I think that's because most people try it and say, I can't play this. I just can't do it. I have to expend way too much effort to be able to play it legally, you know? So that's really where my take on it is. I think the concept is brilliant. I think there's something that I would really love to be able to experience out of it with that asymmetrical aspect. But my guess is the playtesters were the people who could cope with that. Everybody else dropped out, and then it wasn't. And whatever input for why people were dropping out of playtesting or whatever, that just wasn't taken into account. It was like, oh yeah, well, you know, every game's for some people and not for others. No, this game goes out of its way to be unapproachable because of the map. And everything else, you know, there might be issues with some of the other components and everything, but the map is the big one. And they didn't make enough effort to fix it, you know. If they had taken those accounts, those criticisms into account, and given the reaction to the reviewers, my guess is that they just didn't, you know, too much pride or whatever. All right, up it goes. Very sad.